Or I wouldn't think of telling my kids what art they can like and what they can't.
It was another day to rally support with a religious right.
The First Amendment, it's guaranteed, it's forever. Baloney. It was not that way in the early days, and there has been a constant struggle ever since for America to live up to its First Amendment and the commitments that make it the envy of the world. I'm Buck Ryan, director of the School of Journalism and Telecommunications at the University of Kentucky. This spring, to celebrate the 10th anniversary of our First Amendment Center, we convene First Amendment scholars, historians, journalists, and other prominent citizens to help us understand the First Amendment's meaning to the Commonwealth at the end of the century. Allow me to introduce you to some of our participants. Robert O'Neill, founding director of the Thomas Jefferson Center for the Protection of Free Expression. Dr. Thomas Clark, Kentucky's foremost historian. Judy Claves, president and CEO of the Scripps Howard Foundation. Two members of the Kentucky Journalism Hall of Fame, and Dick Wilson of the Courier-Journal, and Sue Wiley, broadcast journalist. Nora Cole, representing her grandfather, I. Willis Cole, a third member of the Kentucky Journalism Hall of Fame. Former Governor Edward T. Breathitt, and Charles Overby, Chairman and CEO, the Freedom Forum. Shortly after the birth of America, Kentucky distinguished itself as a leader in the fight for First Amendment protections. Here was the scene. 1776, the Declaration of Independence, written by Thomas Jefferson. 15 years later, the Constitution, including the First Amendment, the world's most powerful 45 words. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble, and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. 7 years later, 1798, Congress makes such laws violating the First Amendment. They're called the Alien and Sedition Acts, and they mean that newspaper editors are being tossed in jail for criticizing the President of the United States. The First Amendment is not guaranteed. President John Adams, who signed the acts, finds himself with the furious Vice President in Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson secretly drafts the Kentucky Resolutions, which denounce the Alien and Sedition Acts and call on America to return to its First Amendment values. The ensuing debate would launch the reputation of a young Kentuckian as a masterful orator, that Kentuckian Henry Clay. Who better to help us understand the significance of the 200th anniversary of the Kentucky-Virginia Resolutions than Dr. Thomas Clark and Professor Robert O'Neill?
I suspect my primary role here this afternoon is as the token Virginian among you. Even Charles Overby will not on this occasion claim to be a Virginian. He is still partly a Tennessean, so this onus falls upon me. And in fact, I am happy to bear this responsibility because someone needs to come here and formally acknowledge that the order in which you place the two resolutions is indeed the correct order. We tend to reverse the order. We think of the phrase Kentucky-Virginia resolutions, that's some sort of Western bravado. In fact, I have learned from my forays into the history of this period that indeed it was the Kentucky resolution that mattered. The Virginia resolution was almost an afterthought.
Down here where this student union, student center stands, was the site of old Maxwell Springs. And that constitutional scholar, George Nicholas, got up and delivered a long and boring tirade against the aiding and sedition laws and everybody else that he could think of. There was in that audience a young man who had just ridden over the mountains with a brand new Virginia license to practice law, and recommended himself to the Fayette bar as a lawyer of real future brilliance. Henry Clay. That was Clay's moment. And there in the debate of the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, with emphasis on the Kentucky resolutions, Clay started a brilliant political career. As to the importance of the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, I could say, just summarize it in very brief words. Didn't mean a damn thing. No other state ratified it. I ratified them, the two resolutions, and went by the board. I'll take back what I said. They did call attention to this basic matter of freedom of speech.
Professor O'Neill reminds us of another important anniversary.
This spring is also the 35th anniversary of the Supreme Court's decision which really put to rest the last vestige of the notion of seditious libel. Since I had clerked for Justice Brennan the year before, I wish I could have said that I was with him the year that he decided New York Times against Sullivan, but it was coming up just as we were leaving the court. In his remarkable opinion, creating the privilege of fair comment on the lives of public officials and later public figures, Justice Brennan said of the Sedition Act that it had, in his words, violated the central meaning of the First Amendment. And so just 35 years ago this spring, you had the final answer from the highest possible authority, putting any lingering doubt to rest about the viability of seditious libel.
10 years ago, concerned citizens led by Kentucky Post editor Judy Claves convened a First Amendment Congress. Out of those deliberations, and with significant contributions, the First Amendment Center was established at the University of Kentucky. This spring, at Kentucky's second First Amendment Congress, participants were asked to ponder two questions. What does the First Amendment mean to you? And what are the most pressing First Amendment issues on the horizon? Their comments clustered around 7 topics: heroes and martyrs, life without the First Amendment, media credibility, corporate control, the First Amendment and education, the internet and the future, and it's more than free speech. Let's take a deeper look at each of these issues, beginning with heroes and martyrs. Here is Charles Overby of the Freedom Forum, an international organization dedicated to the protection of free speech.
We had a forum in Ireland called Dying to Tell the Story. And we had scheduled one of the top investigative reporters in Ireland, Veronica Guerin, to speak about the problems that reporters in Ireland have. At that particular time, she was doing a major piece on the source of drug trafficking in Ireland. And so she had a quite compelling story to tell. A week before we arrived and to have this forum, she was gunned down on the street by someone riding on a motorcycle. And she died trying to tell that story. And we kept the seat vacant there on the panel and put her picture there.
I. Willis Cole was the owner, editor, and publisher of the Louisville Leader from 1917 to his death in 1950. Nora Cole, his granddaughter, felt so passionately about his contributions to the First Amendment that she nominated him to the Kentucky Journalism Hall of Fame.
It was as effective for him as it could possibly be, given the time that he lived in and given that he was a black man. There's one case in particular called the Bard Fleming case, where he and another editor friend of his, William Worley, who had a newspaper in Louisville called the Louisville News that started in 1912, they together decided that they were going to, they had an interest in a particular case in Madisonville, Kentucky in 1926. There were 3 black men accused of raping a white woman, and they decided that they wanted to speak out against this because there was an earlier case here in Lexington that had happened where a black man was accused of raping a white woman, and he had a trial that lasted 16 minutes. It was called legal lynchings. That's what they called them when they just pushed it through the system like that. So because of their right to speak out, they used their newspapers to do that. They made appeals to the NAACP. The NAACP took it to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court didn't hear the case. And ultimately, the men were convicted, but they weren't lynched. And Cole, my grandfather, and Worley were fined by the courts for speaking out against the justice system in Kentucky and the judge. They were fined like $250 in 1926. So the First Amendment meant a lot to them. I think they were very courageous to believe in it, because it did not necessarily apply to them at the time.
Could you imagine talk radio being one of the heroes of the First Amendment?
The talk radio has been a very good thing for First Amendment because it gives any individual a chance to get on the air and express her opinions, and then you get the conflicting opinions, and it makes people more involved in issues of the day, understanding the issues of the day. It's been a good thing.
I have mixed emotions about talk radio. I've heard some very interesting, thoughtful discussions take place on the airwaves, and then I've heard quite a few at the other extreme. But I think it is a part of the First Amendment. It allows for more voices to comment on what's occurring in public affairs, and with radio, if you don't like it, you can always just touch the dial and listen to something else. There are a lot of countries that would give a lot to have the opportunity to hear something like that.
At Justice Brennan's funeral, a little less than 2 years ago, President Clinton was one of the several eulogists. It was obvious that someone had prepared for him a list of Justice Brennan's most notable achievements. So the president said, "Thanks to Justice Brennan," looking at the coffin which was immediately in front of the lectern, looking respectfully, "Thanks to Justice Brennan, every person's vote counts as much as anyone else's vote. Thanks to Justice Brennan, people's property can't just be taken without due process of law. Thanks to Justice Brennan, the press are now free to criticize the acts of public officials." Then he stopped and he looked down and said, "Mr. Justice, I hope you'll understand that some of us in public life are a little less enthusiastic about that one than some of your other decisions." And then he paused, and he looked up again and he said, "And that's why you were right."
Consider life without the First Amendment. The world of Kelman Hapshu, a journalist from Kosovo where war was raging at the time of our forum.
Here I am listening to how you praise and appreciate your First Amendment, and I think it's probably one of the foundations, as I see it, foundations of your freedom and democracy. But it presupposes a healthy environment in which it can be implemented. An environment which has been foreign for myself for almost all my life. Freedom of speech, which derives from your First Amendment, used in an oppressive environment in which I come from. In most of my career, I've been a journalist for 16 years now, meant being harassed, maltreated, beaten, sentenced to long-term prison sentences, and most recently, allegedly, even being executed. I think that all of you that here in the United States take your First Amendment and the freedom of speech as granted should appreciate it even more hearing me.
Us World War II types, we got to see firsthand what life is like when you don't have the First Amendment or freedoms. And it is has a devastating effect on all the other freedoms.
I grew up in India at a peculiar time when Mrs. Gandhi was in power. Somebody had the temerity to say that she was wrong, and she simply suspended every right. It was really that easy. The only constitution that mattered was her personal constitution. And if she wasn't feeling well about certain things, well, tough luck. So I can appreciate First Amendment because I came of age when all kinds of freedom of expression rights were suspended in India between 1975 and 1977.
One of the greatest threats to the First Amendment is the credibility of the news media.
Most of you will remember the interview that 60 Minutes had done with Jeffrey Wigand, a tobacco executive, who disclosed some information that would have been and eventually became extremely embarrassing to the tobacco industry. The 60 Minutes staff was anxious to insist, and this means Mike Wallace on down, that the interview should be broadcast. They had verified it in all sorts of ways, but a final check with the lawyers, and this turned out to be Cam DeVore, who advised the executives that it should not be broadcast because if it were broadcast, the network could conceivably be held liable for interference with a contractual relationship, that being Mr. Wigand's agreement with his erstwhile employer not to disclose certain information which he acquired during the term of his employment. That decision was widely and I think quite properly criticized. My fear is that from that moment on, there has been a shift that will be very difficult to reverse, in which, I'm sorry to say, lawyers, including some of my former students, some of my good friends and colleagues, are increasingly empowered to make what turn out to be editorial policy decisions if the senior executives, the management, the governing board, will, as CBS clearly did in that case, follow their guidance. So Buck, that's what really worries me from a lawyer's perspective in what's going on.
Does an individual have the right to waive his First Amendment rights? I say no. Sorry, lawyers, I do not think I have a right to waive my right to a trial to jury. I do not think, if I'm Jeffrey Wigand, that I have the right to waive my First Amendment right of free speech. How voluntary is it if Brown and Williamson says, sign this contract and waive your right of free speech or there is no job? How voluntary is that?
I worry that fear of legal action perhaps deters some from being as investigative, as critical as they once were. I think it's going to require a great deal of intestinal fortitude for us to defend the principles of the First Amendment, to be a free and vigorous voice in our government.
And what about credibility in the new media?
I don't think new media per se or cyberspace is the problem. I think the problem's always been the same. If the lines are blurred between journalism and entertainment, or journalism and fiction or gossip, if you can't figure out what is credible information or credible reporting, if people who are in media continue to do things to confuse that, I think that could endanger our First Amendment rights, because people might react so negatively to what they see as excesses.
I think many of us were shocked, if not we should have been shocked, by the latest Pew Research Center polls that showed a marked decline in the public credibility of journalists, and a decline in journalists' own credibility with themselves, for God's sakes. I think that when you have 58% of the American public believing that journalists routinely fabricate material for their stories, we are in a crisis of public confidence in journalism in this country. And I think that it is incumbent upon each one of us to do something about it. We're talking today about loss of credibility. 5 years from now, as Buck asked us to think about, we may be thinking about loss of franchise.
Many journalists long for the good old days, but were they really so good?
I've worked for 3 different newspaper corporations in my 25 years in journalism. I guess when I started out in journalism, the papers I worked for were family-owned or locally owned, and I have to say that I think the charge that corporate ownership is uniformly bad or worse is not accurate, because I think some of the locally owned papers that are sort of revered now in retrospect really weren't as good as we like to remember. Certainly the Bingham family newspapers were terrific to work for, but a lot of the smaller locally owned papers were not the noble sort of free speech entities that we'd all like to remember.
I grew up in a small West Virginia town where I strung for a daily paper a few miles away. It was owned by one gentleman who owned the nominally Morning Democratic paper, and in those days the nominally Republican afternoon paper. One day President Harry Truman came to this town, the first president ever to visit this town. Not one word of the president's visit appeared in either newspaper, because the Republican publisher said, "Thou shalt not." 2 years later, the Southern Newspaper Publishers Editor Association named him the Publisher of the Year.
Corporate control, is that the big bad wolf?
It seems to me that the idea, the spirit behind the First Amendment is to create a vigorous public sphere, a sphere of discussion where power, any color, creed, connotation, can be openly discussed. And it seems to me that in focusing merely on the power of the state, which is enormous, focusing just on the power of the state, we are missing the other power that actually stifles a lot of discussion, a lot of debate, and that is corporate power. So I would like to sort of invite people to talk about the structural dimensions of the media as constituted today in late capitalism in United States, to talk about what kind of things don't get discussed, not because the state doesn't want you to discuss them, but because the corporate power wouldn't allow you to discuss them. You need their advertisements, you need their money, you need their sponsorships, number one. The second thing is the media organizations are corporations. Less and less diversity of speech is taking place as media consolidates. And with convergence across the print, and electronic media, I think this trend is a very dangerous trend to think about.
It reminded me of when I worked at the Chicago Tribune, and it was the day Tribune Company bought the Chicago Cubs. And so everybody's obviously want to know what's going on, right, with the company. But the line in the sports page was, Tribune Company declined to comment.
I thank God for Knight Ridder for what it's done for this community in the eastern half of this state. So it's not just because you're corporate that's bad. It's what you do with your corporate responsibilities. And that's the answer, I think.
But the First Amendment, that portion that pertains to the media, is really a protection of the people. In this state, were it not for the First Amendment and a lot of people who fought for it, we might not have the open records law or the open meetings law or the legal publications law that allow people to know what's going on in their public agencies. Because if you could cut to the heart of most government officials, they want to close all the records and close all the meetings and not tell you anything. And it won't fly as long as people remember what the First Amendment's really for.
To get back to corporate consolidation, I don't see that in my experience affecting news judgments particularly yet. I think the greater threat is the perhaps some evidence of dumbing down staffs, cutting back on experienced people to reduce overhead. That is of greater concern to me than some sort of a corporate overseer making editorial decisions, sometimes with the support of lawyers, but I think that that's relatively unusual.
I think the problem that we see is capitalism is on a roll, everything that's business is good, the business way of doing things is good, and how to protect the freedom of speech, not because of the corporate structure of the newspaper, but because of the increasing power of large multinational corporations who can buy controlling interests and dictate policy, is something we have to think about. Remember, capitalism is not always working where it goes because they haven't had the 200 years we've had to develop regulations and a context for freedom within economic power.
It's not, in my view, an issue of consolidation as such. Certainly not of corporate or chain ownership as such. I think the real problem is more apparent in broadcasting than in the print media. And it's ownership of a major network by some other conglomerate company that really doesn't have any special commitment to the media or to the dissemination of news and information. It's just another possible profit sector. And so when Disney, for example, calls the shots at ABC, as increasingly seems to be the case, or General Electric calls the shots at NBC. Those are the trends that worry me in terms of the corporate role, not simply consolidation or corporate ownership.
The battle lines shift from the boardroom to the classroom, where the First Amendment is under fire in high schools and in colleges.
I just got back from the annual high school convention, 750 high school students across the state, and I talked at great length with a young woman who told me, I only got 2 months left. She was not allowed to use the phrase sexually active in an article she was doing describing if one is sexually active and in high school, one might want to see a doctor. Instead, she did an article on, the first article was on what happens the first time you give blood. The second article was on what happens the first time you go to the gynecologist. And she had to sit with her male high school principal for an hour and justify every line of the story. So the First Amendment applies to me and the First Amendment applies to you. Her story was published, but no 18-year-old girl should have to do that.
Two court cases loom large for student journalists. The Hazelwood case limits freedom of expression for high school students. Professor Ryan explains.
I work mostly with high school students, and we've all conveniently forgotten that under the Hazelwood decision, the First Amendment doesn't apply to them. The Hazelwood case basically said that The First Amendment may apply to high school newspapers, but if it is part of a class and part of the educational mission of the school, then the publisher, presumably the school board or the principal, has the right to review the materials. Some 6 states have rejected this in specific legislation. Kentucky has not.
The Kincaid case threatens to bring the same limitations on First Amendment freedoms to college campuses.
The new case, Kincaid v. Gibson, is about the situation at Kentucky State University. The yearbook was pulled, couldn't be distributed. And of course, there are 2 sides to every case, but apparently the cover was the wrong color. The administration felt that there were too many current events in the yearbook and not enough coverage of people and places and things one might want to remember 20 years from now. And of course, the students and the advisors took the opposite view, that it should be distributed.
What I've appreciated about the University of Kentucky, of course, is that I haven't really felt any pressure that we shouldn't publish, even though we've had very controversial issues regarding anywhere from the basketball coach should resign or should be fired. Back when I first started, I was sometimes glad when I first started here at the University of Kentucky to be in the basement of the journalism building, because they couldn't find me after all the editorials that said, get rid of the coach, get rid of a certain person on the board of directors, get rid of the president's search, all sorts of controversial things that they had an opinion on, and they had the right to express it. And that is what, to me, has been the fun part of being the media advisor and working with the First Amendment, and that these ideas at least get expressed.
I know from my standpoint, one of the most common things that has been said to me over the last 5 years is, oh, you'll hear from the president of the university about that, or oh, you'll hear from the chancellor about that. And I've never received a call on anything that would have been in dispute related to the First Amendment.
As a classroom teacher, I never once had my freedom challenged by anybody, not even by a university administrator who always challenging something. But I never had my freedom challenged.
Remember, if the tenure is not very important to many people today, it's important to us here, but tenure came in as a protection of that peculiar kind of free speech called academic freedom. So when you throw it out, remember, you might be throwing out free speech as well.
I suspect I am probably the only one in this gathering who has been a defendant in a First Amendment suit. That is, one who was alleged and in fact found by a district judge to have violated someone else's First Amendment rights. It was when I was president of the University of Virginia. There was much protest activity going on the upper lawn right in front of Mr. Jefferson's truly sacred rotunda. And I, after considerable provocation and pressures of a kind which Governor Breathitt will surely appreciate, I issued a policy which said there shall be no structures placed that preempt other activities on the upper lawn. A group of students quite properly took me to federal district court, where I was held to have violated their First Amendment rights. Very sobering experience. If you haven't been there, let me tell you, it's not something you want to do often or again. Well, we revised the policies, and we went back to the district judge and finally to the Fourth Circuit, which affirmed the second order. In those revised policies, seems almost trivial looking back, but it illustrates the care that public officials, even if I happen to be the public officials need take with such matters. We had to define structure, and at one point we defined structure to include a chair, save for a wheelchair, but only when the wheelchair is occupied by a physically handicapped person. At that point, we had satisfied the district judge's demand for specificity. And quite honestly, I'd have to say that our earlier attempts to define structure, or to use a word like structure, even a word like chair, were unacceptably vague. So, from a very personal perspective, you want an answer, what does the First Amendment mean to me? It means that even someone who has devoted his entire career to teaching and studying and protecting the First Amendment can be held accountable for doing the wrong thing.
A new test for the First Amendment is being played out on the internet.
I think the newest part of the conflict will occur because of the new media of the internet and information that is placed on web pages and how that might be controlled or not controlled by various special interest groups will become a conflict, and it already is.
The internet is a concern. It is, and the people who want restrictions and some form of censorship on it have some very powerful statistics about the dangers it poses for our children and the millions of children that are exposed to unsuitable materials, and what our library should be doing about it. I think we're just beginning to get into that argument. I hope we don't have any kind of censorship ever of anything, but it's such a political question that who knows a decade from now.
People can express different views, including the views of hateful speech. One of the greatness of American democracy or American free speech that seems to me is it is not merely our right to listen to that which is pleasant and that which we agree with, but it's a kind of a more matured view that we have to be tolerant of views that we find detestable, views that we find terrible, and they too have a right to be expressed. And I think that's an incredible, incredible right.
With pornography on the internet, how to build a bomb on the internet, some people are very afraid of the freedom that people are using to disseminate this information. And so people are going to have to be very strong and stand up for their First Amendment rights so that even though this bad stuff is on the internet, they still have the freedom to put it out there.
I believe the internet is also written word, just like published material, and it deserves First Amendment protection.
I think we are becoming a nation that's in which we're all much too like each other now. And I think when one voice speaks for many people, that's going to happen more and more. I think it's a shame. Individualism seems to be vanishing, and in the media as well as in every other aspect of our society.
What I see in the next 5 to 10 years is essentially a continuation of trends that are already at work. Government is certainly not going to give up on attempts to regulate content on the internet. The first Communications Decency Act was struck down. The second round, called the Child Online Protection Act, which is now in the courts, I suspect that'll be struck down also. Congress is likely to keep trying. They're also going to be much more aggressive in regulating junk email, or spam as it's called. In a second area, I think there's going to be much more litigation, many more lawsuits based on harm that comes about as a result of something that's published or some form of entertainment. We now have a suit against the producers of Natural-Born Killers, suit brought by several people who were killed in a Natural-Born Killers knockoff or copycat crime. The Louisiana courts have sent that case back for trial. I think that's going to be increasingly problematic. Third area that I identify has to do with personal privacy. As surveillance techniques become more and more sophisticated, parabolic microphones, infrared lenses, and long-term telephoto lenses, the protection of personal privacy against media intrusion is going to be a major issue for the courts in the next decade, much more troubling than it is today. So those seem to me three relatively novel areas that I think are going to evolve, become more important in the years ahead.
The 5 protections in the First Amendment stand as pillars in our society: freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of the people to assemble peacefully, and freedom to petition the government to redress grievances. When we asked our participants to reflect on the First Amendment, they told us it's more than free speech.
It means the same to me as it does to every American. That is, it makes the distinctive difference in what makes an American. And that's a wonderful difference. I have the choice individually to speak out against my government. I can read a press that I know is free and vital and vigorous and varied. I can choose to worship as I please without the government telling me what to believe or how to do it. I can protest. I can march in a parade carrying a placard or wear a t-shirt that says women in the House and Senate too, or whatever.
We were graduate students at Ohio State, and we had this collaboration with the University of Amsterdam. So we went out there. There's a whole bunch of people in their late 20s, early 30s, a little bit more mature than your average 19-year-old student. And we were in Amsterdam, and this professor, the Dutch professor, was talking about, well, we can't do this with the media because the state, the government wouldn't allow that. And of course, the American students raised their hand and said, what do you mean they won't allow that? What about the First Amendment? And this professor looks at them and says, what about it? And it took some time, and you could see my American colleagues having a mental double take as they realized that First Amendment is not a universal phenomenon. It is an American phenomenon.
The First Amendment is the bedrock of freedom. Without the ability to say what you think, and then there are no other freedoms. Freedom of religion is based on the ability to do what you want, say what you want. All the freedoms are based, it's the fundamental freedom of all the freedoms.
Religious freedom has kept us out of religious wars and religious disputes, unseemly disputes. There are always forces that are tugging at that. There are always religious groups or fanatical groups sometimes who would like to violate that freedom of religion. But we've been able to stave that off.
This country was populated by people that came from oppression, religious oppression, freedom of expression was stifled, and most of our ancestors came to this country to escape it. And fortunately, those who charted the course for this government saw to it that we were to start out with freedom of expression and the First Amendment rights.
I live in a totally different climate where I can feel more comfortable about exercising my First Amendment right, which is a luxury that is still not 100%. I still know in 1999 it's not 100% that I can use it effectively or without consequences.
Well, I have to think about why the First Amendment is there. And if it gives us the right to talk freely with each other about things that are important to all of us, and if it gives us the right to gather, and it says it doesn't matter what religion you belong to, but you can participate, then it must be there because it implies that that's what we should be doing. So it has a view of politics and of the citizen, of a citizenry that needs to participate. That's how democracy should work. That we all have that obligation and responsibility to come together and decide things together. That's very different than a citizenry that's a persuaded populace. This is an engaged, active citizenry, and I think that's why it's there. And then I have to ask myself, okay, what does that require of journalists?
The First Amendment, boy, just contemplating that is a huge issue. For me, it means freedom. It means I can say whatever I want, no matter how ludicrous, no matter how insane, no matter how crazy, and I can't be imprisoned for that very fact. I can say things, I can express my ideas and opinions and not worry about the government intruding on that expression.
It's the obvious linchpin of democracy. Without it, we wouldn't have the open government we have. We wouldn't have the public access to what government is doing through the media. We would all be living different kinds of lives without it.
Well, I just think the First Amendment is wonderful fodder for all citizens. I mean, people argue about it constantly. They argue about, right now in Kentucky, I can think of maybe 5 or 10 cases that people are talking about. The girl who wore the obscene T-shirt to a community festival filled with families and children, does she have a right to do that? The girl who wore the black lipstick to a school and got kicked out. I mean, there are so many contemporary issues that fly under that flag of the First Amendment that I think that it's a discussion that's very, very much alive and that people are very interested in. And of course, the person who, the body, I should say, which takes most of the flack in all these arguments is the American Civil Liberties Union, which is the fiercest fighter of all for First Amendment rights.
Well, I think when we hear the term First Amendment, people get the idea that it's a protection of the press. And while that's true, it is really a protection of the people in this country. It is more than just something the press uses. It's something that every citizen ought to be aware of and realize that the framers of the Constitution set up certain rights for those individuals. And we need to remember that, those in government and those in the press and the average citizen.
I think it's important to understand that as our founding fathers were working on our Constitution, there was a vigorous and heated debate about whether to have a Bill of Rights. And I'm glad they came down on the side of having a Bill of Rights. And I think it's no mistake that the First Amendment was first, because it is what distinguishes us from just about anybody else and what makes everyone else envious of the American way.
200 years after the voices of Thomas Jefferson and Henry Clay echoed in Kentucky, the fight for First Amendment protections persists. After our forum, a federal appeals court in Cincinnati, hearing the Kincaid case, upheld the censorship of the student yearbook at Kentucky State University. The decision has mobilized First Amendment attorneys from around the country to take the case to the U.S. Supreme Court to have it overturned. But this is not the same high court as in Justice Brennan's day. Mike Farrell at the University of Kentucky has studied Supreme Court libel decisions over the last 25 years. He has documented a disturbing trend. The high court has steadily pulled the rug weaved by Justice Brennan out from the feet of journalists in America. If public opinion matters, there's more bad news. A Freedom Forum poll showed that for the first time, a majority of Americans, 53%, think that there is too much freedom of the press in America. The best way to preserve the First Amendment is to exercise it. The First Amendment Center at the University of Kentucky will continue to be the Commonwealth's forum, stage, soapbox, town square. The First Amendment, it's more than free speech, and it's not guaranteed. Please join us in our efforts to preserve it.
It's by far the world's oldest and most durable guarantee of free expression. No other country has had anything like this First Amendment in its Constitution, so we're unique. I fear sometimes we don't fully appreciate this unique resource that we have in the First Amendment.
And that thin line is difficult to draw sometimes, where freedom leaves off and oppression begins. Thank you.